we've started having a conversation around some of the old story in the Bible, the old Genesis stories. And tonight we're going to look at Genesis 2 and 3 in the story there. And I've put a subtitle on, and the subtitle for Genesis is Saying Enough. You can just put those slides on for me there and start the timer, please. Okay, saying, so I don't speak too long for you guys. Saying enough. And we're going to get into that and what that's all about. But before we do that, I want to remind you of something we spoke about last week. Right? Last week we spoke about this idea that there's a way in which we think, there's a way in which we might approach and think about the Genesis story that is a little bit different from how the people the story was originally written to might think and approach the story, right? And we said in our westernized culture, there's a certain type or certain types of question that we tend to like to ask. Can anyone remember what kind of questions we tend to ask? Anyone, come on, someone. You can just shout it out.
Why?
Not why. Who, not who. How and what. All right. So in westernized culture, a lot of our questions, we're kind of like, how does this work? Right? What is this about? Tell me the what, tell me the how. Right? If we go back, the Hebrew man who's first reading the Genesis stories, the questions he's asking are starting with why, and they're starting with who. Right? So he's asking himself, why is this in the story? What is the story telling me about who God is and who I am? Another way, another facet of how they would look at the story, maybe differently from how we would, that I'm going to introduce to us tonight, that's going to help us get more out of Genesis 2 and 3 as we have a conversation around it, is this. A Hebrew or Western way of thinking mindset, when they go to the Genesis stories, they look for problems. Now, this one's difficult for me because I don't want to look for problems in the biblical stories that I might not have the answers to. But a Hebrew man would look intentionally for the problems in the story because he knows that the problems are in the story are there to catch your attention, to cause you to think a little deeper and to look into it a little deeper so that a bigger or greater truth can be revealed and you can discover it through the process of thinking and dwelling on it. So everyone tell your friend, we're going to look for problems tonight. Right? We're going to look for some problems in the story. Now, when I say problems, this is what I mean. We're going to look for things that are odd, that are strange. Like this isn't like doesn't seem to make sense in normal day life. Like it's a bit weird. We're going to look for things that maybe don't quite make sense in the story, or things that don't quite fit together maybe in a logical way. In other words, we're just looking for everything and anything in the story that's weird, odd, strange, doesn't make sense, is a bit out there. And we're going to dive into that a bit deeper. So let's start. Can you read for me Genesis 2 verses 4 to 7?
Then sit down on the conclusion of the ravens in the earth. When the Lord God made the earth and the ravens, neither wild plants nor trees of growing on the earth. For the Lord God had not sent rain to water the earth. There were no people to cultivate. He said, Springs came up from the ground and watered all the land. Then the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground. He breathed the breath of life into a man's nostrils, and the man became a living person.
Good. All right. Notice any problems? Any problems? Maybe just turn me down. Any problems? All right. I have one. What was Genesis 1 all about? Creation. What is the first few verses of Genesis 2 talking about? Creation. Right. So we have another creation story right off the bat. In other words, what we have is we have one creation, but two stories, two different views, two different points of views or ways of looking at the creation story. Right? And the two stories, what they're going to do is we're going to see in some ways they're going to reaffirm some truths that were told in the first story is going to be reaffirmed in the second story. We're also going to see the second story might reveal some truths that weren't in the first story, and the first story might have told us some truths that weren't in the second story. For example, we are told in Genesis 1 that man is made in the image of God. But yeah, it's only in story 2 of creation, Genesis 2, that we are told a little bit more about what that looks like. And so it says two things. It says, one, God formed man. So if you can picture it, God coming down from his almighty throne in heaven and almost coming down to the dust of the ground and kind of taking his hands and he's forming man. So it's a very personal picture, right? It's a very intimate picture. It's almost like God is taking this very special care as he makes man. The second thing that tells us is that God breathed the breath of life into man. Now, this word, breath of life, in the Hebrew, it's the word ruach. R-U-A-C-H. If you're paying attention, that's the exact same word that we saw in Genesis 1 that is used to describe the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. And so we see, okay, Genesis 1 tells us man is set apart from all other creation because he's made in the image of God. In Genesis 2, it tells us a little bit more about what that looks like, right? In no other part in the creation story do we see God breathing this breath of life, this ruach, which is also could be translated wind or spirit. We don't see it. God does not do it for the beasts of the land. He does not do it for the creatures of the sea. He does not do it for the birds of the sky. It is only man that God breathes a spirit into. And so man, us, we have a spirit, and it sets us apart from the beasts, from other animals, from all the other living things, right? And so part of being made in the image of God is to have a spirit, because God is spirit. Let's continue to dig in and look a bit deeper into the story. And so one of the things off the bat is we are set apart from everything else, all the other living things. So tell your friend, you're set apart. You're set apart. You're set apart. All right, let's read Genesis 2, verses 8 to 14.
And the Lord God planted a garden in the wilderness, and there he placed the man in the field. The Lord God made all sorts of trees grow up on the garden, trees that were beautiful and that produced delicious fruit. In the middle of the garden, he placed the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A river flowed from the land of Eden, watering the garden, being divided into 4 branches. The first branch, called the Kishon, stood around the entire land of Eden, where gold is found. The gold of that land is especially through arrogance, and zinc and onyx stone are also found there. The second branch, called the Gihon, flowed around the entire land of Ash. The third branch, called the Tigris, flowed east of the land of Asher. The fourth branch is called the Euphrates.
Cool. All right, let's dig into this. So, what's my question for you? Anyone want to guess what question I have for you? Right? Any problems? Right? Any problems? Does everyone want to say anything about any problems they see? Anyone? I know you're all shy now because it's all of us. I'll tell you some of my problems that I have. Right? I'm happy to tell you my problems. I find it a bit weird. Like there's all this talk about trees. And there's talk about this tree of knowledge of good and evil, and this tree of life. Like what's that? Like we have orange trees in life, we have apple trees, we have many types of trees, but I've never we don't have trees of knowledge of good and evil. Trees so what is this big deal about these trees? Are they even real trees, or are they trees just representing something deeper? Another problem I have is it tells us that this garden called Eden is planted in the east. Like why are they telling us that it's in the east? And why is it planted in the east? Why is it not planted in the west? Why is it not planted in the south? Why is it not why is that relevant to the story? Right? In the story, it tells us that God places man in the garden. So that gives me the impression that he wasn't made in the garden. I find that odd. That's a problem for me. Look at how the trees are described. Right? It says they are beautiful and they have delicious fruit. Now, I want you to keep that locked into the back of your minds, because later on in the conversation, it's going to become very important again. You might look at verses 10 to 14 and think that's a problem. Like God is making creation, he's made man, he's made this garden, and then we get this whole paragraph about some river in Eden that breaks off into 4 different branches, and it's naming them, and it's telling, like why is that there? It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't really flow with what comes before it and what is coming after. It almost seems a bit odd to have that in the story. And so we could spend all night talking about these problems alone and trying to decipher and decode what they mean and etc. But there's still a whole lot more of the story to get into and a whole lot more problems to talk about. So let's move on. Let's read Genesis 2, verses 15 to 18.
The Lord God placed the man in the garden of Eden to tend and watch over it. But the Lord God warned him, "May you freely eat the fruit of every tree in the garden, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat its fruits, you are sure to die." Then the Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I'll make a help of which she is from."
Cool. So I want to zone in for just a moment into verse 18. And verse 18 reads this: "Then the Lord said, right, it's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper who's just right for him. I want to tell you, you were created to do life with other people. It's not good to be alone. You were not created to do life alone. And so this whole idea of being a lone wolf, right, kind of doing it all on your own, being the solo superhero, it's not good. And I don't know, somehow it's in some ways, in some places, it's kind of made that like if you do it on your own, if you're this solo independent person and this lone wolf, like somehow it's noble or it's praiseworthy, right? And it can even be enticing, like, and we start throwing out statements like, I don't need anyone, I'm just doing me, I got this, right? I don't need anyone else. But it's not good. You were not created to be alone. In fact, this is the first time we see God say this. The whole creation story, God's creating, and he's looking at the creation, and he's saying, it's good. But here we see God looks and he sees man alone, and he says, it is not good. So the solution to the problem, he says, I'm going to make a helper just right for him. Now, we might miss a few things with that word helper. There's two big things or two big ideas that come with this word helper: support and opposition. And so maybe when you read helper in verse 18, you think, well, okay, God's going to make someone for man who's there to support him, but there to serve him, there to encourage him, there to comfort him. And if that's all you thought, you would be missing out on some big and some key elements to that word. Because there's also an element of a type of opposition and challenge that's meant to come with this helper. Another way in which the rabbis would say it is the help that opposes. And to illustrate this point, I'm actually going to need two volunteers from the crowd. I'm going to need two people to come on stage to help me illustrate this, but two people preferably of the same size. It's just going to make this easier. I'm just pre-warning. All right, we got some boys. Okay, so I want you guys to go back to back, so Lawazi, you can face that way. There you go, back to back. So what you're going to do is you're going to, so you guys basically going to squat like this. Now I can't do it, but you're going to lean against each other so that you can go further and further back. Yeah. Lean. Hold. Right, so now what we can see here is they're not falling because there's an equal and opposite force being applied. There's an opposite force this way and an opposite force this way, and it's holding the two of them up. What happens when I remove Lawazi? Right? Okay, good, cool. Thank you. Let's give it up for them. So the moment I move Lawazi, the opposite force is gone. What happens? You fall. And so this idea behind helper is this opposing force that calls out the good, that calls out and challenges one to a higher standard, to a better way, that brings conviction. And so this helper that's made just right for man, yes, there's a role that they're going to play in supporting and encouraging and comforting. And there's a role they're going to play in opposing by calling out the good, by calling out the man to a higher standard, by bringing conviction to the way he's living and the things he's accepted. We see this picture in the Holy Spirit. See, Jesus, after he dies and he resurrects and he ascends to heaven, he says, I'm going to send a helper to be with you, the Holy Spirit. Sometimes we call him the Comforter, and that's what he does. So the Holy Spirit at times will comfort us, he will support us, he will help us, right, as we journey through life as believers. But then the Holy Spirit will also sometimes be our helper by opposing us, by calling us to a higher standard, by seeing the good in us that's been wasted or neglected and calling us to step up into it. And sometimes he will help us by bringing conviction to the way we're treating other people, to the way we live in life, to the things that we are saying. Think about your own friends for a moment. Maybe you have friends that are really good at supporting you, really good at encouraging you, really great at being there for you to comfort you. But there's no opposition, there's no challenge, there's no conviction, there's no calling you to better things, there's no calling out the good in you, there's no bringing conviction to your life from them. And maybe you have friends who are the exact opposite. They're great at calling out the good in you, they're great at challenging you, they're great at bringing conviction to you, but they're not very great at supporting you. and encouraging you and helping you and comforting you. Right? And this helper that's just right has to have both. In other words, the friends that we're going to have that are going to be the right helpers for us have to have support and challenge, encouragement and opposition, comfort and conviction. Let's read Genesis 2, verses 19 to 24.
So the Lord formed from the ground all the wild animals and all the birds of the sky. He brought them to the land to see what he would for them, and the man chose the name of Esau. He gave names to all the livestock, all the birds of the sky, and all the wild animals. But still, there was no help but just right of him. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. While the man slept, the Lord God took out one of the man's sons and put it up on him. Then the Lord God made a woman from the woman, and he brought her to the man, and lost the man. This one is bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh. She'll be called woman, because she was taken from me. This explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and two are united as well.
What question do I have for you? Any problems, right? Anyone want to give me a problem for once before I give you my problems?
Before Adam was telling me that he created these and all of the animals, Adam named all of these animals and named all in one day.
Okay, so the problem there is, did he name all these animals in one day? That's the problem. Like, how do you name all the animals in one day? That's a good problem. Anyone else have a problem for us? I don't have the answer for you. That's a problem. Anyone else? Yes. I have the same problem. The way Eve is made is kind of weird. We're going to get into that a little bit. I also don't have the full answer, but we're going to get, that's a problem. Anyone else have a problem for me? Go for it. Yes, we got problems finally. I think I know what you're getting at. Maybe, maybe not. So the problem there is, once again, the way Eve was made. It's a bit of a weird thing.
God created heaven.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's coming later in the story. That's good. It's good problem. We're going to get to that problem. Okay, one last problem. Let me get one last problem. I like this. I like this. Wait. Why is there a mother and a father?
Mother and father, you shall live your mother and father if it's only Adam and Eve at that particular point.
That's a problem. I've never thought of that problem, right? It's a bit of a weird thing. Like, why are you saying you'll leave your mother and your father if you're the only two people around, right? It's a bit of a weird problem. Okay, one of the problems I have is the whole thing about Adam naming the animals. But my problem with this is this. The story tells us that God looks at Adam, man, and sees that he's alone, it's not good. And so he says, okay, I'm going to make a right helper for him. And we see that in Eve, he makes the right helper. But before God makes Eve, he first gives Adam this weird project of bringing all the animals to him, making him name the animals, and then trying to see if there's a right helper to be found amongst the animals. And no right or suitable helper was found, but of course not. Because what have we been saying? Man is made in the image of God, beast is not. Right? Man has a spirit, animals do not. So man and animals are different. So how can a suitable helper be found amongst the animals unless these differences are resolved? In other words, a suitable helper, a right helper, is going to need to be made in the image of God, is going to need to have a spirit. So why, God, why would you make Adam go through this whole process when you're just going to make Eve anyway, and you know there's not going to be a suitable helper, right? And we see this, then God makes woman, and I have a problem. Like, it's a bit weird, like, how the whole story happens. He makes man fall asleep, he takes a rib, right? He then makes Eve, and then brings her to the man. Like, that for me doesn't, I don't know, it's just a bit of a weird way to do things. And this whole idea of he takes a rib from man, right? So another way to translate that is not just rib, he took a part of man, right? In other words, he took a part of the man and made Eve. And it gives this idea that man and woman, humanity, the picture of humanity can never be complete without male and female. And so the image of God that is housed in humanity is incomplete unless there's male and female. It can never be one against the other. Think of it like a puzzle a bit, right? A puzzle has many different pieces of different sizes, different shapes, but each piece is needed for the picture of the puzzle to be complete. If even one piece goes missing, the picture remains incomplete. Different, but equal. So male and female are made different, but equal. So tell someone sitting next to you, especially if they're of the opposite gender, different, but equal. Let's read Genesis. Cool, yeah, now you all know you're different but equal. We're going to read now Genesis 2. Okay, so let's read Genesis 2, and we're going to read all the way to verse 7 in Genesis 3. So it's going to be quite a bit.
Now the man and his wife were both women, Chalitza and Ishmael. The serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild animals the Lord God had made. One day he was a woman. Did God really say he must not eat the fruit from any tree after any of the trees in the garden? Of course you may eat fruit from the tree in the garden, the woman replied. It's only the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden that we're not allowed to eat. God said, you must not eat it or even touch it. If you do, you will die. You won't die, the serpent replied to the woman. God knows that your eyes will be open as soon as you eat it, and you'll be like God, knowing both good and evil. The woman was convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit was delicious, and she wanted the wisdom in eating them. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. Then she gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it too. At that moment, their eyes were opened, and they said without shame and their nakedness. So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves.
All right. What do I want to know? Problems. Okay, people have problems now. I love this. What's your problem?
Why did he create a tree and place it in the garden and he did not want them to eat from the tree?
That's a good problem. Oh, one at a time, one at a time. Why is the fruit going to kill them? If? Okay. Okay, so I suppose the problem is the concept of husband and wife shouldn't be around yet. I'd say, okay? Yes? Okay. Jesse? So why did God let them eat the fruit? Is that the problem? Cool. I like it. Okay, one more before I get into my problems. One more. Oh, it says they're husband and wife. That's all I can tell you. Okay, that's a problem. Are they married?
Why didn't Adam just watch her eat it? Because she must have been there and she called him.
A problem. Okay, last one. Okay, last one. Okay, thank you. Oh, let's pause. Time out. Probably the biggest problem I have with the entire story, probably the whole story, and definitely this part, is there's a talking snake. Okay, you guys get it. Let me say it again for this group. Guys, in the story, there's a talking snake. You guys get that? That's right. There's a talking snake. Right. When was the last? Okay. Serpent, snake, okay? If you read it in NIV, it'll say snake. If you read it in NLT, it says serpent, snake. Okay? The last time you saw a snake, right? You didn't see the snake stop, look at you and say like, hi, my name is Steve. Right? It's weird. That's completely out of there. Now. We might be very quick, especially those that have been in church for a long time, to kind of just brush over that fact. Especially if you read the story so much and maybe it didn't stand out so much to you. And we might brush over it, well, like, it's Genesis, it's the Bible story, there's a talking animal, it's not that big of a deal. But the only other story that I can think of in the Bible with a talking animal is when God uses a donkey to rebuke a wayward prophet. And the whole point of that story is the fact that the donkey spoke, and that's meant to be like this big climactic moment. It's meant to reveal this deep point. So it's not normal for there to be talking animals in the Bible. It's not normal. Now, you might brush over it and say, well, the snake or the serpent, well, it's the devil, right? It's Satan, it's Lucifer. And I'm not saying it isn't, not by any means. But the Bible doesn't have a problem saying Satan or the devil or Lucifer when it's referring to him in other parts of the Bible. So in other words, why is the author? That's the question. Why is the author deciding to refer to him as a snake or as a serpent here? And it gets a bit weirder because it says the snake is the shrewdest of all the wild animals. Last time I checked, Lucifer was a fallen angel. Right? I wouldn't really classify him as a wild animal. In other words, it's weird. It doesn't quite fit nicely to just throw it off as, well, it's just Satan. There's a deeper reason why he's been depicted as a snake or as a serpent. The other problem I have that no one brought up is in verses 25 and verses 7. So in verse 25 it says, the man and the woman were naked and they felt no shame. Verse 7, it reverses and it says they noticed their nakedness and they felt shame. There's an awkward lot of naked and nakedness in the story. Like why is that coming up so much? What is that all about? And this is something we miss in the English. That if we knew the Hebrew, right, the person who was originally reading it, the person that it was originally written to, would have picked this up immediately, but we miss it. Right? The Hebrew word for naked is erum. A-R-O-M. That's the Hebrew word for naked. Check this. The Hebrew word for nakedness is erom. So it's erom and erom. The Hebrew word for shrewd, other versions will say crafty, is erum. Now, if you're not listening carefully, it sounds like I'm saying the exact same thing. And so in the Hebrew, the word naked, nakedness, and shrewd not only sound the same, but they almost spelt exactly the same. In fact, the only difference between naked and shrewd is a change from a U, from an O to a U. Yes, from an O to U. In other words, what Genesis is trying to do, and the original reader would have picked it up so much, is it's making it hard to distinguish between the snake, the serpent, and man. Is the man naked or is he shrewd? Is the serpent shrewd or is it naked? In other words, it's intentionally trying to play it off that you're not sure which one is which. It's trying to do this intentional comparison between the snake and man, between beast and humanity. But if I had to ask you, what makes humans different from all the other animals, from the beasts? What are some of the answers you're going to have? So some people are getting biology kill me. I'm not ready for biology. Okay. One of the reasons you might say is that what makes us different from the animals is that we talk, right? Our level of communication is far beyond any other animal. But what is the snake doing in the story? It's talking. You might say what makes us different as humans is we have this ability to think and to reason through things. But what is the snake doing? It seems like it's doing a pretty good job at reasoning with Eve, with woman, in this moment. You might say something like, well, what makes us different, what really makes us different and stand apart, is how we're able to relate to one another, right? We're able to have these really deep and complicated relationships. But if you read the story, once again, the snake seems to be doing a fairly good job at relating with the woman. In fact, even the picture of the snake is like that of a man. Later in the story, we're going to see God curses the serpent. And what is the curse? That you will crawl on your belly. In other words, he wasn't doing that already. In other words, the whole thing is the snake is meant to look just like the man. The author is trying to tell us, or to make us see, that it's hard to tell the difference because he wants to make this intentional comparison between man and beast. And he's been doing it since the beginning. Right? He first tells us how man is made different. He then tells us how he needs to make a helper for man, and then he has this whole project with the animals. It's all trying to get us to see that there's this comparison being made, and what we are being invited to do in Genesis is to compare man and the serpent and all these similarities to find the one key difference in the story, because that difference is meant to communicate a deeper truth to us. Now, earlier I said you need to remember what? How are the trees described? Two things: beautiful and delicious for fruit. That's Genesis 2. Check how, when the snake tempts the woman and she looks at the trees, look how it's described. Right? The first thing is, once again, we see that the trees are beautiful. We see that they are delicious for fruit. But the author adds a third point that wasn't there originally, which is that she wanted it for wisdom. And maybe a better translation would say she saw that it was desirable to have wisdom. And this is intentional. The author wants you to realize that third point. The reason it's different from the other two is because he's trying to highlight that point. The key there, the key word, wanted, desirable, is desire. The key, the difference is desire. What makes man and animal different is an animal is always going to be a slave to its desire. You're never going to see a cat because it looks at itself and realizes, hey, I'm a little overweight, but I need to lose some fat. So you know what? Even though I'm hungry and this food, I really like it, I'm going to say no to it because I'm going to go on a diet to lose some weight. But when an animal is hungry, it eats. When an animal wants to go to the toilet, it goes to the toilet. When an animal wants to mate, it mates. An animal follows its desires. It's a slave to them. It has to do what it desires. But us, humanity, you are not a slave to your desires. In fact, you can say enough to your desires. And we live in a world that is requiring or calling of us to say no or enough to our desires more than ever before. And it's countercultural, it's anti-popular, but the world says the exact opposite message. It says follow your desires, right? Go after your desires. Do everything you can to fulfill and to satisfy your desires. Right? Follow your heart. In other words, follow your desires, follow your feelings. And it promises that if you satisfy all your desires, it will leave you with a life that you are happy and satisfied in. When in reality, it leaves you with a life where you are broken, alone, in a mess, and meaningless. So the author makes this comparison. And I think in church circles, we've done a really great job. I mean, hopefully I've done a decent job at youth. We talk a lot about sin, right? And how sin is bad for you, how sin is destructive, how sin kills. We talk a lot about this kind of like this moral law or code, like these are the things you must do so that you don't sin, and these are the things you mustn't do so that you're not in sin. But I wonder if I've done a good enough job talking to you guys about the roots of sin. In other words, what things cause sin in your life? What things actually cause and drive sin in us? And I found there's three different ways, three different agendas you can read this whole verse 1 to 7 in Genesis 3 with, that gives you three different roots of sin. And I don't think it's one or the other. In fact, I think it's revealing the three main things that cause sin to spring up in us. The first way in which you can read those verses is the pride agenda. I call it the pride agenda or the pride way. And this is how I've read it for most of my Christian life, right? The first rebellion, the first person to rebel against God wasn't humanity. It wasn't man. It wasn't Adam and Eve. It was Lucifer. So Lucifer in heaven, at some point, somehow, somewhere, he caught a glimpse of his beauty. And he began to think he's just as praiseworthy as God. That he should be on the throne and not God, that he deserves praise just as much as God. And so pride swelled up in his heart because he thought, I'm better than God. And so he led and he rebelled against heaven. And he was cast out of heaven. And Jesus tells us later, he saw Lucifer fall like lightning. So we can read it with this pride agenda, that as Adam and Eve, man, woman, humanity, looked at this tree that they knew God said they shouldn't take of, and they thought, I know better. Like I don't have to listen to God. I can decide for me what is good and what is not. I can decide for me what is right and what is not. I know better. And I've seen this in my life. I've seen this in the life of others, how pride causes sin to spring up in us. How I can find myself at times thinking, you know what? I don't have to listen to what God says. Joel knows what's right for Joel. Joel knows what's good for Joel. Right? God doesn't need to be on the throne. I can figure this out. I can decide this for myself. And so pride causes sin to spring up. That's one of the roots. The second angle or agenda you can take is the fear and insecurity angle. We almost see the serpent do this. He comes to Eve and he says, did God really, like surely he wouldn't say that. Did he really say? Right? Like he knows you're going to become like him. In other words, God's holding out on you. There's something that you need, and you can only get it if you eat of this tree. In other words, there's something that you are lacking. Fear and insecurity, this dread that, or this belief that we lack something, or unless I do A, B, and C, something terrible is going to happen. Fear and insecurity will lead you into sin, not righteousness. And as I look back on my own life before Jesus and even with Jesus, a lot of my sin came out of a place of a deep insecurity. And I've often found pride and fear and insecurity will kind of tag team and pull a proper WWE SmackDown on me. The third and the highlight of this message, the third way to read the story is with the desire agenda. She saw that it was desirable. In James 1 verse 4 it says, you are tempted by your own desires that lead you, drag you away from God and into sin. And so sitting, because desire is not bad, but seated in each one of us are good desires, are bad desires, and neutral desires. And for a lot of us, it's the neutral desires that we continue to satisfy and continue to allow to grow, and we never say enough to them that end up becoming bad and sinful desires. And so God is looking for a generation that is going to say enough. He's searching for those that are willing to step into their God image and say enough to desires when the time calls for it. To almost draw a line in the sand and say, this is enough. This is enough to fear. This is enough to insecurity. This is enough to sin. This is enough to that desire. Let's read and close it off with Genesis 8-24.
When the cool evening breezes over, the man and his wife heard the Lord God walking by in the garden. So they hid from the Lord God among the trees, and the Lord God walked to them. Where are you? He replied, I heard you walking in the garden, so I did. I was afraid because I was naked. Who told you that you were naked? The Lord God asked. Have you eaten from the tree whose fruits I commanded you not to eat? The man replied, it was the woman who gave me the fruit, and I ate it. Then the Lord God asked the woman, what have you done? The serpent deceived me, she replied. That's why I ate it. Then the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, you are cursed more than all animals, domestic and wild. You will crawl on your belly, groveling in the dust as long as you live. And I will cause hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. You will strike your head and you will strike his heel. Then he said to the woman, I will sharpen the pain of your pregnancy, and in pain you will give birth, and you will desire to control your husband until he will rule over you. And to the man he said, since you listened to your wife and ate from the trees whose fruit I commanded you not to eat, the ground is cursed because of you. All your life you will struggle to snatch a living from it. It will grow thorns and thistles for you. Though you will eat of its grains, by the sweat of the ground will have food to eat until you return to the ground, which you were made. For you are made from the dust, and to dust you will return. Then the man Adam named his wife Eve, because she would be the mother of all who live. And the Lord God made clothing from animal skins for Adam and his wife. Then the Lord God said, look, the human beings have become like us, doing both good and evil. What if they reach out, take food from the shelf and eat it? Then they will live forever. So the Lord God banished them from the Garden of Eden, and he sent Adam out to cultivate the garden, the ground from which he had been made. After sending them out, the Lord God stationed mighty terrain to the east of the Garden of Eden, and he placed a flaming sword that flashed back and forth to God from the tree of life.
There's so many problems. We're not going to get into all of it. We didn't even talk about shame. We didn't talk about the first sacrifice. We could have talked about how sin distorts. There's so much still to talk about, and there's so many problems that people brought up that we didn't get into. But I want to end it with this. One of the names that of God that we're going to be introduced to a bit later is this name El Shaddai. Now, the direct meaning of that name is God Almighty. But there's a deeper meaning. So some of the rabbis, these are the teachers of the Jews, these are the real Bible nerds of the Jews. They had this deeper meaning or understanding of this name Al Shaddai, and it read like this: the God who knows when to say enough. And then they talk about how God knew when to say enough to creation. In other words, he knew when to stop creating and when to rest and to leave creation. And later on in the story, we'll see how God knows when to say enough when it comes to destruction. You are made in the image of this God. So you have been given a spirit that is able to say enough. In Timothy, I think it's 2 Timothy, it says this, and this is where I'm going to close it. It says, we have not been given a spirit of fear or timidity, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. God has infused in you, if you're a believer, a spirit that has the power to overcome pride in your life. He's infused in you the spirit of love to cast out fear, because perfect love casts out all fear. And last, he's given you a spirit of self-discipline, or some versions will say a sound mind, so that you know and can say enough to desire when the time comes.